between 30 and 90. That's the number Amon Goth gave when asked how many women and children he personally shot during the liquidation of the Tarnow ghetto. Not an estimate offered by a witness. Not a figure reconstructed by a historian decades later. His own words. Under questioning. At trial. He didn't know the exact number. He had lost count. 30. Maybe 90. He wasn't sure. That gap, 60 lives, that gap didn't matter to him. 60 human beings, and he couldn't say whether they existed in his count or not. And that imprecision is the evidence. Because a man who has lost count of something has done it enough times that counting stopped feeling necessary. What does that tell you about the state of mind of the man we are about to examine? When does a person stop counting the lives they have taken, and what does it say about them when they do? Today, we build the case against Amon Goth, SS Hauptsturmführer, commandant of the Kraków-Płaszów concentration camp. A man who was called efficient by Heinrich Himmler, called a monster by every survivor who lived to testify, and who was hanged for his crimes in 1946, just meters from the camp he commanded. The evidence is overwhelming. The record is unambiguous. And the full story is worse than you think. Before we continue, if this kind of evidence-driven history matters to you, make sure you're subscribed. Let's proceed. Amon Goth did not stumble into the machinery of genocide. He climbed toward it, deliberately, for over a decade. He joined the Nazi Party in Austria in September 1930, when he was just 17 years old. By 1932 he held full SS membership. He smuggled weapons and radios across the Austrian border for the movement. He was investigated for stockpiling explosives. He was implicated in the assassination of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss. Every step of this man's early life pointed in the same direction. This matters because of what it dismantles. There is a temptation, in history, in courtrooms, in documentary film, to explain perpetrators through crisis, through pressure, through orders they couldn't refuse. Goth's biography offers none of that shelter. He chose this. Repeatedly. At every available junction, before the war even began. By the summer of 1942, Goth had been transferred to Lublin, deep inside occupied Poland. He was now attached to the SS and police forces operating in the region, and he was active in what the Nazis called Operation Reinhard, the systematic deportation and extermination of Polish Jews. He rounded up communities. He organized trains. He processed human beings into the killing infrastructure of the Reich. And he was noticed for his efficiency. Efficient. That word again. I've heard it in testimony after testimony. The Nazis loved that word. It meant, he did what we needed done, and he didn't ask awkward questions. It was this reputation that brought him to the SS Totenkopfverband, the Death's Head units responsible for running the concentration camp system. His first assignment, oversee the construction of a new camp on 200 acres outside Krakow. The camp would be called Płaszów, and once it was built, Goth would command it. The camp took 1 month to build. The labor was provided by the prisoners who would then be held inside it. The Krakow ghetto was liquidated on the 12th of March, 1943. Those judged fit to work were marched to Płaszów. Those who were not, were sent directly to the extermination camps, and gassed within minutes of arriving. Some never made it out of the streets. They built the walls that would hold them. What does a man have to believe, to order that? On the day the new camp opened, Goth made a speech to the assembled prisoners. He told them, in his own words, that he was their God. That it was he alone who determined whether they lived or died. That his authority over them was absolute. This was not a metaphor. Over the months that followed, he made it literal. Goth was placed in command of the liquidation of the Tarnow ghetto, 25,000 people. 10,000 were transported to Płaszów as slave laborers. The final roundups came in September 1943. Trains were loaded. Doors were sealed. The destination, Auschwitz. It was later established that less than half survived the journey. Not the camp. The journey. The trains themselves were instruments of killing. And it was during these operations that Goth admitted to personally shooting between 30 and 90 women and children. Think about what that means on the ground. You're watching a ghetto dissolve. Families torn apart. Children screaming. And the commandant is walking through it with a pistol, choosing. Not under orders in that moment. Choosing. Then came Sebny, a concentration camp holding around 6,000 slave laborers. When it was liquidated under Göth's authority, approximately 1,000 Jewish prisoners were marched into a nearby forest. They were shot dead in the trees. The remainder were sent to Auschwitz, where they were gassed immediately upon arrival, on Göth's orders. Notice the pattern: every operation ends the same way. Some go to the camp. Some go to Auschwitz. The forest. The gas. The distinction between those groups is essentially random from the prisoner's perspective. There is no visible logic, no way to predict which category you fall into. That randomness is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. Unpredictability is itself a mechanism of terror. For these operations, Himmler promoted him. Göth received the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer, a reward, explicitly, for his record of efficient liquidation. The promotion was issued. The paperwork was filed. The Nazi state considered this exemplary work. When a state promotes a man for mass murder, who exactly is on trial? If what you've heard so far disturbs you, it should. But the evidence inside the camp is worse. Stay with us. Inside Płaszów, Amon Goth operated with a freedom that was nearly total. He had a villa on a hill overlooking the camp. And from the balcony of that villa, he would take his rifle and shoot at prisoners below. Not in response to escape attempts. Not in the course of an operation. For recreation. If a prisoner walked too slowly across the yard, a shot. If someone paused to rest, a shot. He treated human lives as moving targets in a game that only he was playing. You learn to move differently. Never stop. Never look up. Never draw attention. You learn to make yourself small, to keep a constant pace, to be unremarkable. Because somewhere above you, on that balcony, there might be a man with a rifle deciding whether your movement was interesting enough to end. He kept 2 dogs. Rolf, a Great Dane. Ralph, an Alsatian. He trained them specifically to attack human beings. Survivors testified watching Göth set the dogs on prisoners, watching them tear people apart, and then, when the prisoner stopped moving, Göth would shoot what remained. A witness stated, "I saw Göth set his dog on a Jewish prisoner. The dog tore the victim apart. When he did not move anymore, Göth shot him." A hideous and terrible monster who reached the height of more than 2 meters. He set the fear of death in people, terrified masses, and accounted for much chattering of teeth. He ran the camp through extremes of cruelty that are beyond the comprehension of a compassionate mind, employing tortures which dispatched his victims to hell. For even the slightest infraction of the rules, he would rain blow after blow upon the face of the helpless offender and would observe with satisfaction born of sadism, how the cheek of his victim would swell and turn blue, how the teeth would fall out and the eyes would fill with tears. Survivor testimony: Göth's post-war trial. During interrogations conducted in his office, Göth would hang prisoners by their legs from a hook in the ceiling, and set the dogs on them while they were suspended and helpless. He enforced collective punishment with mathematical precision. One escaped from a work group, every second worker in that group shot. One prisoner unaccounted for from a crew, every 5th member executed. One man caught stealing food, driven by starvation, shot dead on the spot. The collective punishment doctrine is worth pausing on. What it achieves, functionally, is the destruction of solidarity. When your survival depends on every member of your group following every rule, when a single stranger's desperation could get you killed, you stop seeing your fellow prisoners as companions. You see them as threats. Göth turned the imprisoned community against itself. That is not sadism. That is strategy. The primary site for mass killings inside the camp's grounds was a large hill called Hujowa Gorka. It served as the location for shootings, mass executions, and the disposal of bodies. Estimates place the total number executed there, under Göth's command, at approximately 12,000 people. 12,000. At one camp. In one man's tenure. There was a Jewish cook once. The soup he made was deemed too hot. He shot her. The soup was too hot. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the massacres, those almost have a perverse logic to them, a bureaucratic horror you can trace on a map. But the cook. The boy with diarrhea who couldn't control himself, and what Göth did to him. The man he shot for being too tall, and then urinated on as he lay dying. Those details don't have a logic. They have something worse. Those details reveal appetite. The killings during liquidations, the executions by quota, those were acts of a man operating within a genocidal system. Horrific, but systemic. The cook, the boy, the tall man. Those were personal. Those were a man who enjoyed it. That distinction matters, not to excuse the systemic crimes, but because it tells us something true about who Amon Goth actually was beneath the rank insignia. As a survivor, I can tell you that we are all traumatized people. Never would I, never, believe that any human being would be capable of such horror, of such atrocities. When we saw him from a distance, everybody was hiding, in latrines, wherever they could hide. I can't tell you how people feared him. Goth's maid, testifying at his trial. His maid. The woman who worked inside his home. Who saw him in ordinary moments, eating, sitting, walking through a door. And she hid. Whenever she saw him at a distance, she hid. That is the measure of a man. Not what he does at his worst, but what the people closest to him do when they see him coming down a corridor. What does it take to make your mere silhouette a death sentence in the minds of everyone around you? Here is where the history takes a turn that is almost impossible to process. Amon Goth was eventually removed from command of Płaszów. He was arrested. He was investigated. He faced charges. Not for the murders. Not for the balcony shootings. Not for the dogs. Not for 12,000 executions at WW2. He was removed because he had been stealing Jewish property that the Reich considered its own. He was accused of failing to provide prisoners with adequate food, which meant their productivity as slave labor was declining. He was found to be running the camp poorly by Nazi administrative standards. He was declared mentally ill and sent to a sanatorium in Bavaria. He killed 12,000 people at that hill. He shot prisoners from his breakfast table. He let his dogs eat people alive. And they sent him to a sanatorium. For stealing. This single fact should be taught in every discussion of how genocide functions as a bureaucratic enterprise. The Nazi state had accounting departments for its atrocities. It had property registries. It had standards for the care of prisoners, not out of humanity, but because dead or starving prisoners produced less. The line Goth crossed was not a moral line. It was a financial one. That is the logic of industrialized murder. In a system where mass murder is official policy, what does it reveal when theft is the line they won't allow you to cross? Goth was arrested by American forces at the war's end and handed to Polish authorities. He stood trial before the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland in 1946, charged with mass murder, with personally killing, maiming, and torturing an enormous but ultimately unquantifiable number of people. That phrase, unidentified number, appeared in the conviction record. After everything. After years of testimony, after survivor accounts, after documentary evidence from the Reich's own files, the precise total could not be established. There were too many. The records were too incomplete. The dead too numerous to fully reconstruct. Unidentified number. In the end, the court couldn't count them all either. He had killed so many, that the law itself could only gesture at the magnitude. Substantial. Unidentified. Those words carry more weight than any statistic. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death. On the 13th of September, 1946, Amon Goth was hanged at Montelupich prison in Kraków, near the camp, near WW2, near the hill where 12,000 people were shot under his orders, near the balcony from which he hunted human beings with a rifle. He was brought back, in the end, to the place he had made. There is a question people ask about figures like Goth: was justice served? He was executed. The law reached him. But the scale of what he oversaw, the thousands at WW2, the trains to Auschwitz, the forests outside Sebny, one execution cannot balance that ledger. Nothing can. Justice in cases like this is not an equation. It is a statement. A declaration that the world will not pretend this did not happen. When the crime is too vast for any sentence to answer it, what is a trial actually for? Amon Goth was not a man who was swept up in events larger than himself. He sought this. He trained for it. He competed for the command that gave him power over thousands of lives, and then he used that power in every direction available to him, from the macro scale of organized liquidations to the intimate sadism of individual killings that served no purpose beyond his own gratification. What makes Goth historically significant, beyond the horror of his individual crimes, is that the system around him worked as designed. He was promoted for the mass killings. He was punished only when his personal corruption interfered with the Reich's interests. He was given a uniform, a rank, a villa, and a camp, and the only thing that ultimately stopped him was the Allied defeat of the regime that made him possible. The evidence does not require interpretation. It requires witness. Which is why we tell this story, not for entertainment, not for shock, but because the historical record demands that someone keeps saying, "This happened." These were real people. And the world must not forget them. Convicted and executed, the 13th of September 1946, Krakow. Every fact in this record belongs to someone who can no longer speak for themselves. Consider the evidence, and decide what we owe to the forgotten. Subscribe, share, at WW2 Chronicles TV.